All right, it is 12:02, so we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DATAMARK's fourth webinar of the year on addressing. I am Stephanie McCowett, DATAMARK's marketing manager, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's presenters, Dakota Stoles and Hillary Norcross. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping items to make note of. First, all of our webinar attendees are muted for quality assurance purposes. We wholeheartedly encourage audience participation for this session and all sessions, so feel free to use the chat and Q&A functions of this platform to let us know what you're thinking. This webinar is being recorded and will be released on our YouTube channel later this week. All registrants will receive a follow-up email from this webinar with a link to that recording. And our team will be monitoring the communications that come through the chat and will relay them to the presenters and audience when appropriate during the session. If we can't get to your question before the end of the webinar, we will follow up with you afterward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hillary and Dakota, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll go ahead and start. My name is Hillary Norcross. I'm a GIS analyst with DATAMARK. Very excited to be here and spend some time with you all today. A little bit about me. I've been with DATAMARK for almost 3 years. This was my introduction to public safety. Previously, I did a little bit with public health GIS and utility GIS, and I'm really passionate about public safety. I just, it's such a integral part of all of our communities. So I'm very excited to kind of be part of this team, and to get to know all of you and provide as much support as we can. So that's a little bit about me. I spend a lot of time working directly in GIS data, specifically working with counties, 911 centers, really anyone that is taking on the responsibility of managing GIS for the purposes of 911, and just working on compliance, improving the data, and of course getting into the NENA GIS data model. So I do look at this from very much like a data management perspective, and I wanted to make sure that you all know like kind of where I sit and where I'm coming from at this topic. Dakota, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dakota. I've also been with DATAMARK for about 3 years now. Before this job, I was also doing public safety, so I'm pretty well versed in some of the rules and the NENA standards. I'm really happy to help answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Dakota. All right, so go ahead and jump into the, oh, hey, that's us. Yay, introductions. Let's jump into the agenda. So this is going to be like a addressing question answer session. So we're really curious to know what kind of questions you all have about addressing, and we did take questions virtually before the session and really use those to develop this content, and we're hoping to answer some of those through this presentation today. Feel free to throw any questions, comments that you have in the chat. We'd love to hear from you all. We have our perspectives that we're coming from, and we're also equally curious the experiences and information that you have to share with us as well. So for today, we're going to start with just talking about why addressing is important in the public safety space. Dakota is going to take us through some methodologies for placing address points and really getting into a little bit of the GIS data management side of things. In our virtual Q&A, we did notice a trend of questions surrounding sub-addressing, so we really want to dive into those. And then next, we're going to take a wider lens at our address point and road centerline data sets and how those really can inform some of the questions that we have, and kind of wrapping up with getting into what is in the documentation for how we can best approach addressing and, you know, what we want to this to look like in the future. And so before I start, I'm a little curious to hear from you all of our participants here today in the chat. So my question for you is, where are you in your journey towards NENA compliance with your GIS data? And I asked that, you know, again, coming from the perspective that I do from GIS data management, that will kind of help me, you know, just understand where everyone is at. And maybe, maybe you have really strong data and your data is very compliant and consistent with the data model. Maybe you haven't started at all and you're really just here to learn how you can improve your current processes to benefit 911. Or maybe you're somewhere in the middle. And I think that maybe somewhere in the middle is a lot of where many of us might be. So this webinar is really for everyone, right? There's always something that you can do where you're at to improve, maybe add something in that you hadn't been doing before that'll be helpful. So that's really what we want to kind of focus on today, is what are, you know, some general ideas that we can all be kind of thinking about to improve where we're at. Hey, Ryan in Alabama. Yep. Remediation. I'm right there with you. Great work there. And, you know, hopefully we can have some good conversation today. Hey, Rebecca. Yep. Not using it yet. Oof. Yeah, I hear you. It can be a long process, and that's okay. You know, we can't do things overnight necessarily, and so we kind of have to make plans, right? So that sounds like what you're doing, which is awesome. Learning addressing here in Texas. Hi, Melanie. Yeah, same here. Feel like I learn something new every day in this job. Backlogged. I hear that. Yep. QA/QC. Hey, good for you for focusing on QA/QC. That's awesome. All right. Yep. So I'm really excited to see all of you coming through in the chat here. You know, I'm definitely curious to hear where everyone's at, and if there's a question that comes up and you think you have a good answer, please go ahead and throw those in there as well, because kind of want to make this, you know, very much like a community space. I definitely don't have all the answers myself, so I appreciate it. All right, so addressing and public safety. Addressing is something that obviously, and depending on, you know, your community, I mean, it's going to affect a lot of different areas. Those include things like planning, that'll impact public works, not necessarily always just public safety, but we do really encourage prioritizing public safety and making sure that the needs of the community and the needs of your responders are being met and, you know, considered as we place addresses in the community. So our priority really, when we think about this, is getting our first responders on scene efficiently and effectively the first time, right? So not a lot of margin for error. Sometimes it really is true that seconds matter, and we just want to do whatever we can to make that possible for our responders. And when we think about that, we do want to make sure that when we're addressing, consistency is really important, and having just a methodology behind how you do that can really be helpful, to just try to avoid, you know, creating confusion unintentionally, right? So we want this to be logical and easy to maintain and update. So hopefully we can give some good tips and tricks on that today. What are some challenges in public safety? And we know that they're there. You all have already thrown a lot of them into the chat. So here's some challenges that, you know, we've noticed here at DATAMARK, and also just based on some of the themes of the questions that were provided. Communication between the address authority and 911 can be an issue, and that could be that could present in a couple of ways. Maybe the address authority is not always aware of what might be helpful for 911 purposes, and so there can be that disconnect. And another issue that can come up is the communication of like new addresses back to the public safety teams, and making sure that information and data gets shared quickly and efficiently can be an issue. So definitely a challenge, and is going to vary per community, how that gets addressed. We do want to dive into sub-addressing today. We're going to talk a little bit about those larger campuses and, getting those additional dwellings or unit assignments, having a workflow around that. We know that sometimes we don't necessarily have as much control as we would like with how things get addressed. So maybe developers are self-addressing, or even I'm imagining, with an ADU, maybe someone throwing an address on there. So we won't talk too much about the specifics of like address ordinances, but what I will say is that, as consistent as you can be is going to be really helpful. And we want to limit and avoid self-addressing as much as possible. I would say that is not helpful in a public safety perspective. Another challenge that actually came up in the questions that were sent in are just some concerns and complications with long or shared driveways, which sometimes you can have a long and a shared driveway. And so we'll give some examples and talk a little bit about best practices there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Dakota. And Dakota is going to walk us through some address point placement methodologies. So take it away, Dakota.
Yeah, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about address point placement methodologies, and some of the questions covered. Common themes we saw were, what's the best practice for addressing structures when in your county when another driveway entrance is another county? How to address multiple structures on a single parcel, and then best practices for address point placement. And on the next slide, we'll talk about that.
Oh, there we go.
So first I want to talk about address point placement and road centerline ranging, actual versus range potential, because this can affect addressing. So actual range represents ranges that already exist on the street. So if a house has 133 to 167 on one side, and 134, 135 to 138 on another side. Sorry about that, the parity is wrong. I'm just talking about that, but you would address the road based off the actual ranges of the houses on the street. That could be problematic if you plan to add in new addresses on that street. Then you would have to remodify the address range on those streets. So that brings us into address range potential, and that would represent the lowest possible address range to the highest possible address range. So 1 to 100, and then you would typically reflect address numbering standards based off the addressing authority. So if you go up in increments of 4 or 10, you would then place your address points accordingly, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the accurate point placement of the street if you're going in symmetrical values. So it might not fall where the house actually is. So that could be an issue to think about when you're creating ranges for streets. And on the next slide, we'll talk more about address point placement, unless there's any questions about this specifically. We'll give a minute for everyone to type in the chat.
I don't see anything yet, Dakota, so we'll keep an eye on that and go to the next slide. Here we go.
Yeah, so these are some of the placement methods that we see commonly. The most effective you're going to want to do is place your address points on the structure. This is because when you dispatch, we'll know exactly where the structure is located. There's no guessing work. where the structure is. If there are multiple units on a structure, you would just place, the address point on the approximate location. So dwelling A and dwelling B, you would split the points between the two. Another example is site placement. So if there's a park, you'd want to put a park, a campsite, anything similar. You'd put an address point in the center since there's no structure there. That's kind of the placement method for areas with no structures. Are there any questions about these?
I see a couple questions in the chat, Dakota, and I can go ahead and offer an answer. So Victor, you say you currently use ranges, which maybe you're using actual, maybe you're using theoretical ranges there. I would say no, maybe likely not to be compliant, although I would have to know a little bit more detail there. But what I want to offer for that, Victor, is that we're going to be talking a lot about like best practices, and there is a lot of room in the data model to be compliant, even though maybe things could be improved, the level of detail could be improved. So I would say you may be compliant, but what we want to talk about today is just ways to kind of continue to improve, if that makes sense. So great question. And then there is one more question I see right now. So let's see. We're talking about new subdivisions. We create, as new structures are built, we issue addresses based on its, okay, not a question. So yeah, that's, it sounds like you're planning for the future there, Rebecca, which is great. I think that as you do addressing, it can be helpful to think about what might be coming next and not just about the addresses that you need to assign. So sometimes if you have maybe the roads already planned out, you can determine ranges for those for the future addressing there. So yeah, we'll keep going, Dakota, but I'll keep monitoring the chat here.
So we move to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about access points and parcel placement. So access points, a little bit of a bigger discussion. This is kind of addresses the question about what happens if you have a structure in one county and an access point from another county. You could create an access point layer, and at the edge of the driveway or gate, you could put the access point to the structure. So that would represent, we access the property from this area, and this is the actual structure. This also works for long driveways. So, your 911 services need to find an address, but the house is pretty far from the road. You might want to put an access point to show how to access the property, and then another point on the structure to show where the structure is. And then the next placement method is parcel, which is something we want to avoid. It should be used as a last resort because you want the address point to go where the structure is or be close to it so it can be found. It can make it harder for emergency services to find a structure if we don't know exactly where it is. Generally, this is where other spatial, like aerial or other spatial data, is not available, so we have to take a best guess. Does anyone have any questions about these methods?
I have some comments in the chat. Christy, I do see your question in the Q&A about problematic subaddresses, and I'm going to get to that on a future slide. Great question. So we'll answer, we will give our feedback and, give some examples, maybe not fully answer your full question, but we'll do our best. All right. Is having an updated parcel fabric essential to migrating to an NG 911 system effectively? Is it essential? I mean, I would say any reference data you have that is accurate will be extremely helpful. But no, I would say it's not essential. I wouldn't wait on that Charlotte, to start your journey to getting into NENA compliance, right? I would start with where you're at. So if you're having any issues with, and again, you know, I would need to know a little bit more about your context there, but I would not hold off on, you know, enhancing your data for public safety if there's any issues in that parcel fabric. If that makes sense.
Another question. Oh, sorry.
Dakota, on if the address is not on the house, how do you place it on the residence? Do you have any feedback there, Dakota?
You could move it in the GIS data, or if there's like say there's like 3 buildings and you only have 1 address point, like as you see in the parcel method, you might want to put it in between the buildings. And I don't know your specifics, so we can get, if you have more questions about that, we could ask or answer that later on. Reading some of the other questions.
I think we're good. We'll go ahead and keep moving forward.
Okay.
Thanks for all the questions and comments in the chat. All right. Okay, so we're gonna move into a little bit about, you know, kind of taking a scope onto how these addresses are used in public safety and why it's important. Talk a little bit about standards and best practices and our sub addresses. So when we think about addressing, we want to remember that these addresses are going to be used in quite a few different ways that affect public safety. And it can help to start to get an understanding of how these systems work, and that'll, you know, hopefully inform your workflows. And, you know, I would always encourage you to engage and bring in your public safety professionals to kind of hear their feedback as well. So very often we're going to see this data being used for some kind of computer aided dispatch. They may appear on a map display for your 911 centers. And they're also used in what we call geospatial call routing. And I promise I'm not going to bore everyone with a whole bunch of technical talk today, but I do want to give just a little bit of the view of how this really is going to look. So the data that is being created for your addressing, which is going to include, although is not limited to, those address points and road center lines, that is going to be used, you know, starting with your 911 caller. So before that even gets to a dispatcher, or before that even gets to a map to send a first responder out, that data is going to be used to really direct that 911 caller to the correct PSAP, right? So all of this sits in this GIS data management box here, and we're only as good as the data that we have in here at that time. So we want to kind of keep in mind the context that we're working in when it comes to public safety. So with that in mind, a couple of recommendations that we have for address points is we do want to recommend that when we are assigning addresses to new buildings, new structures, we want to be thinking about giving an address to the structure versus giving an address to the parcel. And I'll get into a little bit of an example of this on the next slide, but ideally you would have one main address per structure rather than one main address per parcel. Now, this will get us into a conversation about, you know, compliance versus best practices. And, you know, I'm not here to say that that is like a NENA requirement, right? The NENA requirements and compliance, there's a room for a lot of unique situations. But the reason that we want to make that recommendation is that, practically speaking, that's what's really going to help our first responders navigate to different areas the most efficiently. So while we're not here to say that you have to do things a certain way or not, we want to kind of change the mindset to how can we address in a way that's going to make, our first responders a little bit less confused and more easily able to navigate where they need to go. So what we would recommend is really focusing more on assigning those addresses to structures and not so much based on the parcel. And we would say that it's okay to have multiple main addresses on a single parcel. So, again, really assigning those points to all inhabited structures. A couple of things that can cause confusion, while acceptable in the data model, might not be as easy for first responders to kind of work with, are having a lot of alphanumerics in your address number, fractionals and hyphens. If what I would say is, while acceptable, if you can avoid them, do, but be aware that we know that there's things you have to kind of grandfather in, or existing practices that might not be easy to change. So we like to recommend avoiding those when possible. Another recommendation that we have is keeping street numbers at 6 values or less, because it can just start to get a little more confusing after that point. Let's talk about subaddressing. So really, the key to subaddressing would be having the data be as unique as possible and as complete as possible. So here on the left, we kind of have an example of a large campus, and we can see that there are multiple structures on this campus. There's even multiple access ways in here. So what I would propose, and I'm curious to hear, how you all have handled these kinds of scenarios in your contexts. From my perspective, the best thing that you can really do is, if you can give a name to a road, I would do it. It's just gonna make that wayfinding to that structure a lot easier. And I would assign unique main addresses to each of the structures. And then, do your subaddressing based on those units that share the same access point, rather than assigning multiple units to different structures. Because I'm sure we've all been in the situation of maybe an apartment complex that's not so easy to navigate your way around. So that's what we would recommend for public safety. And I would say that assigning names to roads can really be helpful as well. We do get a lot of questions about mobile home parks, and again, I would give the same recommendation there. If possible, go ahead and assign those access drives names. And if that's not possible, that's totally okay. We see that very often in municipalities where that it wasn't addressed that way. Maybe it was addressed off a main road. And what I would offer there is, that is still compliant, and that's still a way to do it, but you want to recognize that it might be a little bit more confusing if your addressing is set up that way. So signage, we kind of sometimes have to think beyond the map here. Signage in those mobile home parks, logically assigning those units to the mobile homes in a way that's consistent and easy to determine where that individual unit's going to be, will be really helpful in those scenarios, because we don't have that extra level of detail there. All right, so for our, we do want to consider road center lines when we're thinking about addressing. We had some really good questions about, different ways to range your road center line. And again, there's there's going to be differences between, different systems and the way that things are done. Sometimes we might have, going back to one of our first slides about theoretical and actual ranging, sometimes you might have a range that encompasses a small amount of addresses. Sometimes you might have more of a theoretical like block range that might encompass a lot of potential addresses. What I would offer you is that we want the representation in the road center lines to reflect the real world as much as we can get that there. It doesn't mean that actual ranging it doesn't mean that having a theoretical range is a bad thing. And very often it can actually be the right way to go. But we do want to make sure that if we have an actual address existing in the real world and it's not encompassed within that range, that's where you can run into issues with your system. So we want to be mindful and making sure that our data is as accurate and complete as possible. Coming back to the discussion about naming roadways, I do want to offer the NENA recommendation, and this is not a standard, it is a recommendation, is that if there are 2 or more structures sharing an access way, it's recommended to name the road and assign primary addresses there. This is going to be really helpful with not only having the data reflect accurately, but increased wayfinding, kind of, getting from A to B is going to be a little bit easier the more you name those access way roads. Also, this can help with availability of address numbers. So if we have a main road and we're kind of running out of space in that range of address numbers, it could be because we have a lot of these access roads off that main road and we're really just we might need to be thinking about assigning, those access roads names rather than continuing to pull from that main road. I would also recommend keeping the naming as unique as possible. I know sometimes in my community, I'll see things like First Street and right next to it will be like First Court. And while acceptable, and it makes sense. I mean, I can understand the planning that goes into that. But the public safety side of my brain worries a little bit that there might be some confusion between those addressing. So if you do have similar sounding road names, maybe think about how those get addressed. You can maybe avoid putting like a duplicate house number on those same roads, and maybe that will, help avoid confusion. So really just kind of thinking through scenarios that can happen with those kinds of road naming.
All right, Hillary, so we do have a few questions that have come up in the chat. We're having a really active chat today. So I think anything we can't get to, we will try to get to it towards the end of the webinar. And if we can't get to those, we will make sure to get back to you guys personally via email. So it'll either be me, Hillary, Dakota, or someone will reach out. So I did see a few questions. The first one, how about sub-addressing for hotels and motel rooms?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I'd like to do in a couple slides, I'm going to review some of the fields in the data model for sub-addressing, and maybe we can kind of brainstorm at that point how that might impact, hotels and motel rooms. So let me put a pin in that question. Stephanie, if that's okay, and because I think that looking at that that data model will kind of help us visualize how that could work.
All right, and then one question from Tammy: is there a way to deal with road names and campgrounds and mobile home parks that conflict with existing official municipal street names? Is there a way to effectively identify the unit addresses within NG without renaming the whole park?
A great question. So yeah, it can be difficult, like, and a lot of the we want to kind of make good suggestions for new addressing because for this very reason, right? Because if road names or addresses are assigned and again, maybe they were self-addressed or maybe whoever and again, usually it's not through the fault of the person who assigned it. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, right? So what I would recommend is having a good validation process, of course, on your existing data, because we can't go back in time. We can't, change how something was addressed. So really having good ways to identify duplicate data so that you are aware of any situations that currently exist in your jurisdiction that could really be a source of confusion. And then I would also suggest, to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future, having a way to validate your new road names and your new addresses against what is current, to really limit the possibility of duplicates. Because if you don't have that information in front of you, a mistake could get made, right? So that's something that we focus on a lot here at DATAMARK is, workflows, those kinds of things, and it can vary from community to community how that's done, but those are how I would suggest to avoid it. As far as dealing with that current situation that you have, I would need to know more. But what I would say is that the uniqueness is key. So anything that we can do to provide a unique identifier to those two areas is going to be really helpful to first responders, because you don't want to wait for there to be an emergency to figure that out, right? So that's something that you would kind of want to look at from a 911 perspective and make sure that those calls get routed accordingly. And I hope that makes sense and answers your question.
All right, awesome. So we're seeing some additional questions come through, but Hillary, I think in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move forward with the presentation, and we will save these for after the session.
Awesome. I'm really excited about these questions. And like Stephanie said, if I don't answer it right this second, we will get back to you. I definitely appreciate it. Oh, and here we go. Stay on this slide. So with with addressing, driveways can be a little bit of a pain point. Some questions that come up are, when should there be a road name, right, for these access roads? Sequence can be a problem, where the structures might be in a specific order, but then the drives to get to those structures are not in the same order. So that, it can be a question of, well, how should this address sequence go? Coordination with neighboring jurisdictions at boundaries, that can kind of cause some confusion there. So what I would suggest, I think it makes what I've seen done that I find might be helpful is, if there is a question about sequencing the addresses where you have a lot of long drives, it makes sense to me personally to sequence it according to the access, so that as you're driving along the main road, you see, 101, 103, 105 from the drive. Now, does that mean that should be done in every case? Absolutely not. I would look at things on a case-by-case basis, but I don't think there's anything wrong with sequencing along the main road. And then I would refer back to some of the discussion about sub-addressing. Again, the NENA recommendation is if an access road has, 2 or more structures along it, it is ideal to name that road. Now, I've seen I've heard comments back to that recommendation that, well, we really only do it when there's maybe 3 or 4 or 5. And I think that makes sense too. You know, and it's going to depend on your individual kind of scenario, what the best option will be there. But just know that, you know, when we're looking at those GIS systems, you know, thinking about how the computer-aided dispatch software is going to work, it definitely is dependent upon those unique attributions and the connection of the road to the address point. And so the closer level of detail that you can get, the better that map is going to function in getting you to your destination, right? So that is definitely the ideal scenario. Another suggestion I would offer is, even if driveways are unnamed, which of course, you know, many are, sometimes for this reason, municipalities will name certain driveways to really increase the ability to navigate to them. But even if they're unnamed, you can still digitize those driveways, whether it be in your road centerline or whether that be in a separate GIS layer. And that can provide a level of detail that is extremely helpful. And I would also think about going beyond the map, right? So I recently worked with a county that has a lot of really long driveways. And, you know, at first, you know, that at first you notice that might be a little bit confusing for navigation. And within this particular county, when I would go and investigate like the aerial imagery and the street view, I could see that there were, it looked like official address point numbers at the entrances to the drive. And even it looked like officially provided address point numbers at the access points to the structures themselves. And those kinds of things can be extremely helpful if resourcing in your area allows. You know, if we're not able to have the map kind of take us exactly where we need to go, we know that, especially in rural areas, it's not always possible for the map to do all of that work for us. So signage and having kind of like clear and consistent policies on that can be really helpful. So you know, and again, it does depend on your resourcing. So let's say that that's not possible in your context. Letting the community know, you know, I think there's plenty of people out there that want to take on a level of personal responsibility if they know. You know, I think about folks who are maybe renting a new apartment or buying a new house, and you get all of this information sent to you from all of your vendors, you know, like your electric and setting up your mail and all this stuff. And I'm sure there's ways of communicating to those people the importance of, you know, having good addressing, making sure that everything is visible. And so keeping those kinds of things in mind too. I mean, bringing in the community, I think, is a really efficient way of getting the word out there that this is important. So I'm all for being creative and going beyond the map with some of this stuff. I think it just needs to be a coordinated effort. Anyways, back to my wheelhouse of GIS. So no street name label, and I want to address this question. It caught my eye, Sean. I've actually seen people just put driveway in the street name label if you're actually putting them in your road center lines. Again, it's not perfect. It definitely doesn't, you know, give you that connection to your address points, but it can be a beneficial thing to have in your map. So sometimes it's, you know, not perfect, but a helpful option. All right, so I wanted to give a quick example of what I was talking about with these shared driveways, and kind of reiterate that there are options here with how you can address these and represent them in your GIS. So in this example, we have what I'm calling a shared driveway right here in the middle. And in this iteration, we are addressing these structures off of this main road. Now, these green lines represent how these structures would then geocode back to the road. And you can see that the sequence is, you know, it's not super clear where the access point from the main road to those structures is. Now, this is certainly allowable and common in when we address, you know, we're not always going to have names for these shared driveways. And so what I wanted to offer and show you is that this is how the system is going to interpret that. And so, you know, as we arrive to these structures, there's going to have to be some interpretation of where the access way is to this. And this is where access points, you know, outside of your address point data can, you know, there's ways to be creative here, but you do have to understand how your addressing is, the way your addressing is going to kind of affect the system there. Now, I wanted to show you option 2, which would really improve your wayfinding and, you know, help your responders get where they need to go more efficiently. And that would be to throw a road in here and give that road a name when these get addressed, and then address these based off of that roadway. You can see that the geocoding is going to bring us directly, like more directly to these driveways, to the particular structures. And there's a lot less like interpretation and, you know, thinking we have to do to know to make that turn onto this shared drive and get to these structures. So this is kind of how the system is going to interpret, and forgive my, you know, my little drawing here, because I am, I like to do drawings to get what's in my mind out to you all, but definitely more of a GIS person than an artist. So I hope you like it. All right, so I want to get to that question. I'll come back to this one about the motels and hotel rooms. So there's a lot of different configurations that a motel or a hotel could take. I want to be mindful of that in answering this question, so that I don't give you one recommendation and you think you have to, you know, do that for everything. So I think that there are definitely situations where a motel could have maybe multiple structures, and I would not want you to shy away from assigning multiple main addresses in that case. You know, depending on the situation. So I would say that there's definitely scenarios where you could have multiple addresses in the motel or hotel, but let's just say that we have, you know, kind of a main building. What I want to look at here is all of the options available to you in the data model to really give the level of detail that could be extremely helpful in that kind of situation. So let's say you have a motel and maybe there's 2 buildings, right? So, and even if those 2 buildings only have one main address, you know, we can still differentiate those by putting in a building number. And building is part of the NINA data model, so we can add that level of detail in. And depending on, you know, whether they give those buildings like a number or maybe a letter, the data model can account for all of that. So I would definitely encourage that level of detail when you have those kind of situations. We can also, I would really consider utilizing the floor level of detail for a motel. You know, maybe you have 2 floors, maybe even more than that, 3, 4, you know, however many they have. And you know, it depends on the situation, but you know, larger apartments, motels, it can be really helpful to have the floor number assigned to each unit, just so that there's not that additional question when your responders arrive on scene of, we know the unit number, but what floor is it on, right? So I think that developing out the level of detail there can be extremely helpful. We do want it to be accurate, so I wouldn't say that, you know, just throw in any number right as you're developing out your data. And I know that these kinds of things can take time, and it's not necessarily, you know, something you can just do with a one-day project. So I say that recognizing that, but working towards building out your level of detail. You know, I would say if there's building information, floor information, and of course, having your sub-addressing information in your addressing data is so helpful to public safety. Now, you know, because it's in the data model, you know, the data model does allow you to go out to room and seat level, where we can see like cubicle 23. I'm not suggesting that you have to get to that level of detail. That is available. The data model accounts for it, but you want to start, you know, start with what you can put in, and we can always add further level of detail in the future. So, you know, focusing on just getting some of those really more critical aspects in there can be extremely helpful. I'm gonna take a look. Yeah, unnamed road for driveways. I've seen that. We need a separate alias table for gates and road names. It's good that you're thinking about that, Denise. And yeah, it can be a debate. There's advantages and disadvantages to a lot of these things. Hey, Joyce, thank you. I'm looking, I'm right there with you, Joyce. I'm looking at these questions now. That makes me think I should scroll back up a little bit. If anyone has a question that wasn't answered and you want to plug that again in the chat, feel free, because I'm seeing a lot in here and I really want to answer them all, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. So I will continue to try to keep answering those. Thank you all so much for the engagement. I do want to point out a lot of the information that we covered today. You know, I use you know, the projects I work on and the situations we come across, but even, you know, coming up with protocols for the projects that we do, I really rely on the NENA information and standards. A lot of this information can be referenced back to these documents. And there is a difference between a lot of what we talked about today are best practices. They're not necessarily standards. So if you were to look at the GIS data stewardship document, and this is the reference for that, that's a lot of best practices, right? That you can choose to implement if they're helpful. You know, a lot of the recommendations that I have around like driveways and sub addresses, that would be more informational and rather than a standard. The site structure address point info document is also extremely helpful if you want to know more about addressing, or maybe if you want a, you know, a nice document to fall asleep reading, because it can, a lot of this stuff can be hard to read, right? A little bit boring, but extremely useful. So I would recommend, if you ever have some free time, to take a look at these. And then the standards documents, of course, you know, these are more to do with the compliance, right? And, you know, what is truly required for these systems to function. So always be referencing your GIS data model in the CLDXF document. All right, I'm going to jump here. So the really one of the last things that I want to offer is really having, really thinking about your workflows and having a quality assurance process. And I really think that this goes in both directions. So for your actual addressing process, where you're assigning addresses, subdivisions are coming in, I think that having a quality assurance stage at that step is extremely useful. I do say that knowing that context can be very, very different. But if anything that you can implement to check on, those new road names, check on those addresses, have just some checks in place to make sure that the addressing that's being assigned is not going to cause issues in your public safety response, And then also looking at your current existing data. Like I mentioned before, we can't always go back in time and readdress things. And sometimes there's going to be less than ideal scenarios. So just having a way to validate. So having iterative validations, focusing on NG 911 in whatever way works best for you is really a good place to start, in my opinion, and can really inform possible workflow items to add into your addressing workflow. And then across the board, public safety education for everyone. I think that includes for anyone working in the GIS, anyone working in addressing, and also just the public as well. We want to, as much as you can kind of get everyone on your side, I think that helps enormously. And I know that there's challenges with that, and there's obviously other concerns that people have. But the more we can kind of educate, I think, is really going to be key. So with that, if you want to connect with us, please feel free. I'm not sure if my email is in here, but if you guys want to reach out to me or to Dakota, we're available. My name's Hillary Dakota, so feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to kind of continue this discussion. There's a little bit about what DATAMARK, this is the kind of stuff that we work on. So we're here to help, and we're happy to if you are in need of that. All right, so let's see if we can answer some of these questions. And looking at the Q&A, one of our local jurisdictions has begun using fractions. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it just complicates the data. So my question would be, what is the purpose that those are fulfilling? And, have they run out of addresses in that range? What's going on there? Is there a better way to capture that data? Again, by no means is it not allowable, but we have received feedback that it can just cause confusion for public safety. So great question. Something that I would want to dive into and, maybe have a coordinated effort with that jurisdiction to figure out what's going on there and maybe see if there's a better way to do it. Their fractions are not necessarily bad or wrong, but they can just be difficult to work with in data, and it can cause confusion for responders to know what unit they might be going to.
All right, Hillary, so we have a couple of additional questions in the chat. Do you have extra time, or do you have to hop off?
I'm here.
All right.
If you could help guide me to some of the questions, that would be fantastic.
Definitely. We had so many questions come in. Thank you guys. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything today. We tried to address as many as we could that popped in the registration pages, but I know this is always a super popular topic. So I'll be sure to share reference material in the follow-up email as well, so that you guys can get the answers to things that you need. I know that there was also a question here about doing a part 2. We can definitely do a part 2 to this. Stay tuned. Make sure you're checking the webinar calendar. We can definitely follow up with a lot more. All right, so getting back to the questions, Tammy was asking, she has a kind of a 4-part, but the first question is options for sub-addressing in private campgrounds where roads or numbering don't meet municipal standards.
Can you, hold on, I'm looking for that.
Is that
Can you
12?
read that again, Stephanie? I apologize.
Yeah, that's fine. So options, Tammy is asking first for options for sub-addressing in private campgrounds where roads or numbering don't meet municipal standards.
Yeah, it's a great question. I know that can cause confusion when we're not following the same standard. I would probably need to know more. I apologize, but the main thing I can think there is signage would be extremely important. You kind of want to think back to some of those road centerline examples and really understand, where is the system, like where is that mapping system going to take someone if they're trying to navigate there, and where are they going to need help getting where they need to go, and is it reasonable to expect someone to kind of be able to find, those individual units where they might be dispatched to? So I hope that kind of helps. I wouldn't necessarily put like a standard on you right at that point and say you have to do this, but I would try to work with what you have and, really do your best to kind of make a plan on what is going to happen when we have to get to that location. So that's what I would say to that.
All right. And then the second piece of her question is how to manage data at draft stage in order to distinguish from actual or approved addresses and street names.
So I know a lot of the time when you have like a draft, I'm just picturing a subdivision, you might not have road names assigned yet, right? So we might be looking at like A Street, B Street, and then lot numbers. So again, what I would offer is, I would have a clear protocol on who should be assigning the updated street information. What are those new road names going to be? I have seen people, when they actually assign those, like link it back to the lot numbers just in case there's confusion, in between the planning and the assignment process. Those are the kinds of things, those are the kinds of questions that I think falling back on having a good workflow and having defined, doing it the same way every time is really going to help you with that. I don't have a lot to offer specifically, to that scenario, but what I would say is just be consistent and, don't assume that someone is going to know exactly what to do, right? We want to kind of have a plan already in place so we know what that's going to look like.
All right. So Scott is asking if you have a multi-building, multi-unit storage facility, would you recommend an address point for each unit or just one for each building or one for just a site? Storage may be inside units or even boat and RV storages.
Yeah, good question. No, like, if I just hearing that, like, do I recommend for each unit? Not necessarily. We have kind of like when I think about a structure, I'm thinking kind of like inhabited structures, dispatchable locations, like mobile homes are a great example where we actually have people living in there. So if it's not an inhabited structure, you may not, right? But what I would say is, if you have like a huge lot, you might want to consider, assigning addresses to like individual larger structures instead of just having a parcel address, if that makes sense. It's totally okay. Like, I'm thinking of, an apartment complex I lived in that had like garages that really weren't at all associated to the apartments themselves, and they actually addressed each of the individual garages. So I have seen it, but it just, you would want to try to have it make sense. And if they're going to be united, you might want to think about like, well, where, if I'm getting this address dispatched and it's address like 101 Main Street, I would expect a unit of 101 to be fairly close to where that dispatches me. So if it's like a mile away, that might be confusing, right? Of finding that, that unit number. So I would just, again, like, go back to having it be like consistent and logical and easy to find, but you don't necessarily have to give primary addresses to each of those, if that makes sense.
All right. And then what is the best way to handle anomalies between historic site structures and road centerline range disagreements?
That's a good question. And what I'm imagining here is that you have a road center line and maybe the address point doesn't fall within the range. And that I will say that hopefully those are edge, and I'm assuming those are kind of edge cases, right? Ideally, we want as much synchronicity with our address point layer and road center line layer. But there is a reason we have both, so it might be an exception. That might be okay. Like, it might be something that is flagged in the system. Like, we know that this is not going to geocode to the road center line. So yeah, there's not always ways to, have everything represented, because reality doesn't always fit the model, right? So that is okay in some situations. But what I would offer you is just, we want to make sure we have an understanding of how that's going to impact our system and make sure we have redundancies in place. Having the address point there is going to help. If there's a way we can, range a segment of the road, maybe that would work. So there's potential ways you can handle that, but sometimes the reality is not going to fit the model. And so if we have an edge case like that, it could be an exception.
All right. And then we still have a few more. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to hop off, but let's do one more.
All right.
Again, we will be sure to go through this list and make sure that everybody has the answers to the questions that they asked during this webinar. We just got a lot coming in. But
let's see a lot of requests for part 2.
We're definitely gonna have to do a part 2. So what do you recommend resource or method as being most efficient and accurate for validating address location? From Thomas Walsh. Thomas.
Yeah, there's a lot of methods you could use. I mean, the one that I'll highlight is validating it by geocoding it to your centerline, making sure that the attributes in your address point, like your street names, your ranges, that address point is falling within the range. And that's a way you can kind of highlight what we were discussing, where we have an address that doesn't fall within the range. And that'll point out possibly scenarios that you're unaware of, right? That exists and could potentially cause a problem. So that is one way that I like to go about validating address points. Another way, another thing to think about is using outside sources to do some comparisons. I could think of maybe like a utility, if you can get data from like a local utility company, maybe like a voter registration, those kinds of things. Like if they're housed separately data-wise, then you can use other sources to compare to what you have and see where the differences are.
All right.
Just 2 suggestions there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you to everybody who stayed around. We really appreciate you participating in our webinar today. You will definitely get a part 2, so look out for the invitations. They probably won't be next month in May, but potentially in June. So we'll definitely let you know. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and thank you. Look out for the recording. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.